Wahneema Lubiano, African and African American Studies.
Sandy Darity, African and African American Studies.
Rick Powell, African and African American Studies and Art History and Visual Studies.
Mark Anthony Neal, African and African American Studies and English.
So I've been fascinated by Paul Beatty's novel Slumberland, and I discovered when I was teaching a class on global blackness with Wahneema that she was equally fascinated by the novel, and so we included it as part of the curriculum for the course. Beatty's previous novel is probably more well known, The White Boy Shuffle. And I read that and enjoyed it a great deal, but I felt like it was somewhat derivative from Ishmael Reed's style of creating novels. And so when I read Slumberland, I said, oh, okay, now this is truly Beatty's voice. And then subsequently, he's had a novel that received the Booker Award? Yeah. The Sellout. I mean, so I think this is excellent also, but I don't know that I think it is as excellent as Slumberland, but one of the things that we attempted to do in that class on global blackness was examine the relationship between African American literature, primarily fictional literature, and this is inclusive of film as well as novels as well as poetry, their relationship to the investigations and explorations social scientists have undertaken in terms of attempting to understand the nature of Black America or the nature of the global Black community. And so Slumberland was particularly interesting from that perspective because Beatty actually makes explicit nods to social science research in most of his novels. He does so in Slumberland, and he does so in greater depth in The Sellout, where there are direct references to a variety of psychological experiments, where the father in the novel actually performs these experiments on his son. But there's also an extensive set of references to economics, economic theory, data about racial inequality that's economic in content in The Sellout. But there's some of that in Slumberland as well. But I guess I'd like to highlight some themes which I think Wahneema may want to extend on or take in a different direction. So the novel is set in, well, we're not really sure of the time period, but ostensibly it is set in the period just before the Berlin Wall falls. But there's some ambiguity about that, and that gives the novel somewhat of a speculative science fiction flavor. Okay, when events actually take place become more and more ambiguous as the novel proceeds, and then there's a twist at the end which some people have interpreted as suggesting that none of what happened in the novel actually happened. I don't think that's the case, but there are some people who have suggested that. So it's set in Berlin, so there is this grand metaphor of the role of the wall as not only this physical separation between East and West Germany, but in some sense, the wall functions, I think, as a separation between cultural sites and even the interpretation and the nature of blackness may be characterized as being on two different sides of a wall. So the main character is named Ferguson Soul. Okay. And in one of the literary critiques of the novel, somebody suggests that this is a pun on S-O-U-L. It is not. It is not. It is the combination of the name of the economist Thomas Sowell with the economist Ronald Ferguson. Okay. And of course, and it's not an homage. The name is used as a critique, because Sowell has historically denied the existence of structural racism and has argued that racial economic inequality is due to Black behavior and Black dysfunction. Okay. Ferguson, while not as atrocious as Sowell, has demonized black youth culture by making the argument that black kids don't do well in school because they have been adversely affected by hip-hop culture. This has produced a dysfunction, and so my cohort, the much older cohort that Ron Ferguson is a member of, we listened to Motown music, and so we came out okay. But the younger generation listens to hip hop. So he names the character Ferguson Sowell, but the character also has another persona. He calls himself DJ Darky. Okay, and he's actually the curator of he's the music curator for a nightclub that's called the Slumberland. Okay, and so DJ Darky can be interpreted as a reference to DJ Spooky, Paul Miller, and in a way it again functions not as an homage but a critique. So we can come back to that in the discussion period if you like. The other thing I want to mention at the outset is the use of the term the schwa. So Ferguson Sowell's on a mission. He's trying to find this phenomenal jazz musician who has disappeared into Germany, who is known as the schwa. Well, the interesting thing is the schwa's real name is Charles Stone, which I sometimes think might be an oblique reference to the journalist Chuck Stone, but I'm not certain about that. But the term schwa could be interpreted also as a shorthand for Schwarze, which would be the purest expression of blackness, not constrained in any way, but the unbounded creativity of this particular artist who uses the wall as the interpretive mechanism for his final composition, which is this powerful composition that transcends all compositions ever done before. And so so I thought that was very interesting, the use of the schwa. I'll stop there because I think that's kind of an opening. Yeah.
I decided that while Slumberland produced the impetus for me to think about global blackness, I was actually much more interested for this conference in thinking about concepts as a field of desire. So that's what this paper is largely about. So, of course, we, AAAS, did not invent the phrase. Global blackness lives and has lived at a plethora of sites, disciplinary and public, under no direct supervision as of yet, has had no claim laid to it by institutional entities, and lacks established epistemological limitations or descriptions of established measures of strict form. It lacks protocols of usage or hierarchies of disciplinary methodological claims. So out of thinking about this, I did Google searches over the past few weeks, regular Google searches, not Google Scholar searches, because I wanted both to see what would just be thrown up as well as how different forms of scholarship might fit into those searches. Google searches keyed on the simple phrase global blackness, and found myself more than a little surprised by at least 10 years of the phrase's appearances in places as widely disparate as Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's The Undercommons, a blog piece in the Huffington Post, in a series produced by the HuffPost and the Black Lives Matter Network, an essay by Silvio Torres Celiont, published in the journal Small Acts, and a notice for an exhibit and lecture in the Jameson Gallery in the Friedel Building next week by Jemima Pierre, Associate Professor in the Departments of Anthropology and African American Studies at UCLA. Okay, so quite an array. But it was in the scholarship of the philosopher George Mills where I just found a particular starting place for my specific interest in thinking out loud about what I might want from a concept. Mills establishes global white supremacy as his name for a large, complex, and interlocking political, social, and economic system that exists both in parallel form and is interwoven with other systems such as capitalism. Miles's decision to call it a system is his means of insisting on the racial dimension's irreducibility to other large systemic variables. The work of Mills's global white supremacy, then, allows for attention to racial particularities as part of a toolkit of world understanding. So, I thought, if global white supremacy's explanatory ambitions are historical and chronological, social, economic or material, cultural and political, as George Mills was claiming for, Charles Mills, might global blackness exist as a corollary, a reorienting of such explanatory ambitions by means of mimetic transfer to the ideological work of specifying the subject production process, not the subjects, but the process that speaks back in historical, chronological, social, etc., counterpoint, or to move into similar terrain termed racial capitalism in Cedric Robinson's magisterial Black Marxism. Global blackness can be understood to be a product, a process, and a critique of or critical stance against the domination through which capitalism was made in the New and the Old West, as the historians Walter Johnson, Sven Beckert, Eric Williams, Robin Blackburn, and numerous others have established. Yet global blackness is at the same time a fungible rubric for seeing what its complicated and variegated subjects have made of themselves and the world. That is to say, global blackness does not exhaust itself in positioning an ontological, racialized identity for people of African descent, dispersed geographically and temporally by the capitalism made possible through the theft of their labor and the capital accumulated by the monetizing of their asset value, along with, of course, the theft of the land from the indigenous people. Global blackness is a synecdoche for all of the complexity of movements and social and cultural relations, as well as creation along the vectors of those movements. It does the contradictory work of epistemologically generating a critique of racial capitalism and insisting that racial capitalism as a changing same was and is the immersive condition of possibility for much more than capitalism's intended outcome. Nonetheless, one might well ask, in the context of Black studies, doesn't the term Black diaspora also do that work or some of that work? Maybe. Under the circumstances of the rhetorics of the moment that produced Black diaspora and circulated it, under the influence of the desires and the linguistic kinship of what the term already noted, the Greek origins of the term and its history of describing even older population dispersals from original homelands under various compulsions, Black diaspora claimed the world significance of African dispersal and thereby established a place in the hierarchy of history's horrors. Given global blackness's widely increasing circulation over at least the last 7 to 10 years, I fancy it as the name in this moment of capitalism that overrides the sovereignty of states, smoothing the movement of capital across national boundaries in pursuit of more efficient exploitation of labor and capital flows, greater ease of commodities movements, and at the same time has not left behind the specifics of its racialized history. Global blackness, then, given our present conjuncture, works to state the conditions under which Black Americans can produce accounts not just of identity, but of cultural production that moves along the circuits of dispersal. Global blackness names attempts to analyze relations geographically and materially, instantiated with attention to the political and cultural particularities of those circuits. I was lost happily in the mist of intellectual poetics. At the same time, I was trying to pretend that I could aspire to the degree of precision of the social sciences. Still, lingering in the diffusion of global blackness is a desire that haunts whatever language is used to gesture towards some form of common belonging, something that haunts but isn't explicitly articulated in my title's question: what might we want from a concept? And in this case, what might we want from that particular concept? So at this point, I turn to a dance not of argument or analysis, but a dream work, a poetics of thought. In that sense, global blackness does anchor to some extent an ontological existence and essential identity as part of a desire that one might have for that kind of reassurance. But it does so as a desire for, an acknowledgement of, not so much an identity, but a longing for something more than an account of the history and the effect of the making of Black subjects and subjectivity on the ground of and amidst the conditions of capitalism, whether garden variety, nation-state capitalism, or our newer world of sovereign-less capitalism. In other words, if Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism is a historical account, if Charles Mills's global white supremacy is a system-oriented account of the conditions that forced a social kinship that did not rest on directly observable or verifiable genealogies of belonging, then global blackness also names a desire for company, for recognition of more than past or present immiseration. And it's that desire and that longing that takes me to Beatty's Slumberland. You know, you all have the basic plot summary, and Sandy has already said a lot about that. It takes me to Beatty's Slumberland and the movement of its protagonist, DJ Darky, from the US to Germany in search of the perfect complement to the perfect beat, the musical legend, the schwa that Sandy's already talked about, and as well the unexplored for DJ Darky terrain of Germany, of Berlin. I differ with you with regard to the wall. I think it's after the wall has fallen, but I think part of what goes on is a rebuilding of the wall that makes that uncertain. Schwa's engagement in rebuilding that wall. But anyway, back to what I was trying to say. Okay, so the novel demonstrates, through DJ's Darky narrating of his move to Germany, an encyclopedia of U.S. racist history and many different kinds of music, especially Black American music, through a recounting that offers details of specific musical genres, as well as the hybridity of all forms, including a continual and obsessive recounting of his ongoing war against Wynton Marsalis and Wynton Marsalis's gatekeeping around the purity of Marsalis's preferred forms of jazz. Along with U.S. racist history and his cargo of musical knowledge, DJ Darky transports a cornucopia of Black and white American and German stereotypes as well. The novel offers the mode of satiric fiction as the vehicle for a critique of both U.S. and German racist histories, as well as his own lack of critical self-consciousness, as he is himself figured in defenses and affirmations of musical battles through his own curatorial work. He is the curatorial intellectual of specifically the jukebox at Slumberland, the bar. So yeah, the novel is forthright frivolity in the name of intellectual regeneration, and is at the same time an offering of a snapshot of the complexities of global movements of cultural production, of examples of Black musical art, of a tracing of Black possibility that does not rest on some imagined purity of essential identity or of respectable stewardship of Black musical histories. The novel continually includes in its origins of DJ Darky's Holy Grail, the specific music's existence as a soundtrack to a pornographic film involving chickens. That snapshot's complexities do not depend upon deification of music's lived existence or on the tracing of Black possibility through music in terms of Black respectability politics. Instead, the telling of the protagonist and Black Americans' relation to white supremacy moves along the cultural circuits of dispersal, of musical commodification, and liberatory impulses. In fact, the novel's preference for anti-respectability cultural politics is its most consistently displayed aesthetic, deployed in a continuing critique of U.S. and European white supremacist fascination with Black subjects as objects of desire, and the movement of those subjects through everyday, ordinary culture intertwined with extraordinary musical legerdemain. I've taught with Slumberland, including the course that I taught with Sandy for a few years now, along with non-fictive analyses, historical accounts, theoretical and speculative engagements with racial capitalism as a way of slowing down to a snail's pace the urge to keep in mind a dizzying array of the complexities of global Blackness, a way to perform what Michelle Wright in Physics of Blackness refers to as verticality, a concept that she generates to interrupt any confidence that the sweep of geography and history are sufficient vectors for making sense of Blackness. By verticality, Wright means attending to previously insufficient and underimagined hierarchies of power and influence and their marginalizing effects within Blackness. Hierarchies, for example, of sexual desire, hierarchies of appropriate objects of scrutiny, hierarchies of the respectful approach to those appropriate objects. Slumberland could not possibly be less appropriate in its representations of the complexity of Black Americans' movement across the world, as exemplified by DJ Darky himself, the Afro-Germans he encounters, as well as the extraordinary musical achievements of the culture produced within the immiseration produced by racial capitalism. Its narrative of music and Black dispersal is articulated under the pressure of parody as the means of managing and aestheticizing those complexities. I'm going to end with a passage that demonstrates Slumberland's narrative organizing of a critique of white German condescension around music. The protagonist's awareness of the power dynamics that are the engine both for his existence as the walking embodiment of Black American otherness, his dependence on that condescension given his own economically marginal status, a moment of his continuing war with Wynton Marsalis, capped off by his insistence that racial gerrymandering on the part of white Germans simplifies history, and his insistence as well that immiseration is not the engine of Black musical artistry. Okay, so I've sort of crunched a particular longish paragraph. And this is from the first chapter of the second part of the book. The text reads, West Berlin was like a city populated entirely by Quaker abolitionists. Everyone was so nice to a point. When I went to local jazz clubs like the Quasimodo or the A-Train, patrons at the bar would buy me drinks as an excuse to pick my brain about jazz and American racism. This was a typical conversation. Thanks for the beer. Ken problem, I bet you're glad not having to drink that shit American beer. Blah, so bad. Yeah, you motherfuckers are onto something with these Pilsners. Then Willie, Carl Ludwig, and Bruno would defer to the American expat who'd take us stupefyingly mediocre saxophone solo that would inexplicably bring the house down. At the bar, my newfound friend would put his arm around me and say, you know, jazz improvisation comes from the slaves having to improvise in order to survive. Too bad every idiom of black music, be it jazz or rhythm and blues or whatever, has declined in its Negro ordery and purpose. It's become whiteified. Now I know why Harriet Tubman faked those blackout epileptic seizures. It was the only way she could get those damn abolitionists to stop patronizing her. I quickly learned not to respond to jazzophile opinions that, judging from their use of words like negroidery and whiteified, had been stolen from the latest Wynton Marsalis magazine interview. If anybody was whiteified, it was the suit and tie wearing Marsalis, like Negroes hadn't seen a white face until they saw the slave catcher, as if all the fucking race mixing in Spain, Egypt, ancient Rome, and Ethiopia never happened. But I knew no Berlin jazz aficionados wanted to hear me denigrate their romantic notions of white oppression being the progenitor of black musical genius.
It didn't take long after proposing today's lecture to realize that my topic, the often tenuous positions that selected African-American visual artists and their works often hold in the modern and contemporary French art world, was hopelessly large, complicated, and virtually insurmountable in the framework of a brief talk. And it's an old story, with the exception of such larger-than-life personalities like Josephine Baker. Black Americans hardly register at all on France's cultural radar. Similarly, if most French critics were asked to name the most important producers of Black American art, one would be more likely to hear the names of Sidney Bechet, Miles Davis, and Lenny Kravitz over the names of any visual artists. And if French cultural commentators and historians were forced to limit their roster of African-American creativity to the visual arts alone, probably no more than three: the legendary mid-20th century painter Buford Delaney, the acclaimed sculptor and longtime Paris resident Barbara Chase Reboul, and the graffiti artist turned neo-expressionist Jean-Michel Basquiat would receive the majority of references, if any. One might extend this lack of awareness for African-American visual arts and artists to a broader indifference towards American visual arts in general. Several major curatorial initiatives to bring American art to France have been undertaken over the last 30 years, most notably Un Nouveau Monde, Chef d'œuvre de la peinture américaine at the Grand Palais in 1984, Made in the USA, L'Art Américain at the Musée des Beaux-Arts, Bordeaux in 2001, and Les Artistes Américains et le Louvre in 2006. But the overall response to these exhibitions was reserved, if not lukewarm. But is one really surprised, in a country where for centuries the visual arts have been virtually synonymous with its identity and cultural worldview, that American art hardly matters? Of course, France has not been able to completely resist the cultural insinuations of American popular culture, especially jazz, rock and roll music, and hip hop. But France, even beginning with the mid-20th century ascendancy of American art, has nevertheless maintained its stature as the world's art capital and still reigns supreme as the global arbiter of culture and aesthetic distinction over and above the recent cultural stirrings from America. A major part of the problem regarding this myopia towards African-American visual expressions clearly stems from the art historical portal, namely the fin de siècle American expatriate painter Henry Ossawa Tanner, that French audiences are asked to enter for this cross-cultural rapprochement to transpire. While Tanner's part symbolist, part impressionist endeavors were remarkable by most American standards, especially considering the widespread racism of his times, his salon-sanctioned career was neither exceptional nor compelling in the French context. But even taking into account this cultural disparity, Black American innovators in the visual arts, such as Bob Colescott, simply do not materialize at all in France's trajectory for modern and contemporary art history. Originally, I was going to talk today about unrequited love. Black visual artists loving Paris, while Paris, weary of these unsolicited suitors, ignores them. But instead, I want to talk about the pull and push of France and how selected African-American artists have used France, and Paris in particular, as a conceptual device that, rather than simply functioning as a catalyst for their art and/or careers, energizes the work. In short, I want to move towards a more sober art historical examination of how divergent perspectives in the guise here of both artists and social environments bump and brush against one another, and as a result cause the art to convey a variety of philosophical positions which, when thinking specifically about African American encounters with France, French art history, and/or French critical theory, do at least three things. One, valorize the art historical past. Two, critique racism's capacity to efface or erase Black humanity. And three, rupture, or rather breach the lines of art historical dissent. The historical example of Henry Ossawa Tanner is the worthy example, but I want to especially consider two more recent artists, Bob Thompson and Carrie Mae Weems, whose respective engagements with France each prompted varying responses worth re-examining. Arguably, what these two artists took from their French experience was neither an undiluted art history lesson nor the stock narratives of personal freedom and social liberation, but instead layered and often conflicted points of view which, when considered in the context of their actual time in France and their French-informed work, reflect the gamut of ideational models within a modern Franco-American cultural economy. Bob Thompson and Carrie Mae Weems will hopefully put Henry Ossawa Tanner's experience in a new light, or at the very least, put his hyphenated cross-cultural identity on par with other members of Les Clubs, for whom Paris was the great leveler, a socio-aesthetic ideal which retained special relevance and meaning for Americans, refugees, modern artists, and other post-Enlightenment seekers and creators of truth. A recurring theme in African-American artistic engagement with France, and with Paris in particular, are the lessons learned in art museums. African-American artists such as Tanner, his predecessor Edmonia Lewis, and subsequent figures like Albert Alexander Smith, Lois Mailou Jones, Archibald Motley, clearly learned a great deal from the old masters that they saw in French museums. But painter Bob Thompson made the Renaissance and Baroque masterpieces he encountered in France and throughout Europe his work's key source material in a proto-postmodern act that perhaps only Paul Ricoeur's theories of distanciation and appropriation can explain. Bob Thompson was singled out early in his studies at the University of Louisville as an exceptionally promising young painter. By the late 1950s, Thompson had migrated east and was part of a circle of artists who, between the art colony of Provincetown, Massachusetts, and the free jazz scene in Manhattan's Lower East Side, experimented with high-key expressionistic approaches to figure painting. From the early 1960s until his premature death in 1966, Thompson crisscrossed the Atlantic several times, living and working during these years in New York, Paris, Ibiza, and Rome. Thompson, apart from a frenetic and dissolute regime of hard drugs and la vie bohème, produced a dazzling body of work which, in its sophisticated reconceptualization of the art canon, pays tribute to that art historical past by vividly yet impassively exposing the timeless quality and value of his source imagery. An example of Bob Thompson's transformative powers, especially when confronted with France's cultural legacy and indelible image bank, is his 1965 Death of the Infants at Bethel. Based on La Mort des Enfants de Bethel by the French Baroque artist Laurent de la Hare, Thompson's painting unapologetically borrows the basic composition and figural schema of the 17th century work, but where the earlier painting situates its death scene and reminder of God's wrath in a classical landscape filled with ancient ruins and idealized human casualties, Thompson's canvas is awash in brilliant pigments, forming shapes and delineations that no more than suggest sky, land, animals, and human beings. In Thompson's studied hallucination, Corinthian columns morph into vertical tree trunks, and clothed actors become nude silhouettes, distinguished only by their contrasting hues and hair. Rather than a warning against blasphemers, Thompson's Death of the Infants at Bethel neither warns nor admonishes. It exteriorizes an Old Testament massacre in an even-handed, equivocal manner, matching the grand mortality of French classicism and its nobility and design tenets with the ostentatious parody and improvisational flourish of Black American cool. I also contend that Carrie Mae Weems's 1994-95 residency in Paris contributed substantially to the Framed by Modernism series she created in 1996. Comprising 3 photographs of herself and fellow artist Robert Colescott alongside his recently painted Venus series. The triptych mediates on the omnipresent gaze of the paradigmatic artist in Weems's conceit as once male and white, which, when directed at both she and Colescott, implicates him as a conspiratorial witness to the liaisons dangereuses which has ostensibly transpired in this fictive tableau. Recalling the titillating pictures in photographic journalism of world-renowned painters posing with their nude models, Weems's Framed by Modernism complicates this time-honored tradition by giving the artist's model a voice, actually her voice, which narrates not only her subjectivity, but that of the iconic male artist who finds himself framed, or rather constrained, by such modernist symptoms as sexism, racism, and in the particular context of French art history, the idealization of the body. Carrie Mae Weems's interrogation of the relationship between power and aesthetics, in combination with that dialectic as experienced in Paris's world-class collections and popular media outlets circa 1995, resulted as well in Not Manet's Type, which, like Framed by Modernism, provided an adjacent running monologue about Weems's body in art and his projected treatment in the hands of such celebrated artists as Manet, Picasso, de Kooning, etc. The 4 self-portraits appear in round vanity mirrors within each photograph. Am I there? There I am, yeah. With their reflective bedroom locations giving the effect of a private, intimate moment clandestinely captured on film. The 4th and final image in Not Manet's Type, that of Weems's luxuriating nude and alone on a brass bed in full daylight, suggests female autogeny, in the creation of the Black woman's image. And while the photograph's subtle titles refer to Frida Kahlo's and the feminist art icon from Mexico, the larger context for Not Manet's Type is an African-American feminism whose theoretical emphasis revolves around hypotheses of positionality, point of view, and social recognition. In conclusion, I'd like to return to the artist Bob Thompson and look closely at his 1965 painting, Homage to Nina Simone. The composition of Homage to Nina Simone is answerable to a French classical antecedent, specifically Nicolas Poussin's Andros ou la grande bacchanale avec femme joie de lutte. But as art historian Judith Wilson has noted, Thompson's choice of this Poussin for his painting's compositional template is odd, given the shift in the principal protagonist from Poussin's elegantly attired lute player to Thompson's exposed and hot pink Nina Simone. But this perceived disjuncture doesn't give Thompson enough credit for successfully imaging the conceptual bridge that connects Greek and Roman mythology with the Black American jazz scene, or on the visual front, Poussin's classicism with Thompson's expressionism. That this ability to traverse, or rather simultaneously validate and annul cultural borders, was a skill that Nina Simone herself had mastered professionally, is ably demonstrated in countless recordings and performances, especially in her adaptations of others' signature compositions. It isn't hard to imagine that upon experiencing Nina Simone's dirge-like odes and defiantly laying claim to the compositions, Thompson, likewise riffing on a French prototype, was afforded the opportunity in his homage to depict a formidable force of nature. Simone's splayed nude body and flame-like coiffure interjected a brazen feminine element whose incendiary presence effectively revised Poussin's bacchanalian notion. Ensconced within Thompson's landscape of undulating terrain and iridescent sky, Nina Simone takes on even greater significance, recalling Carrie Mae Weems's City of Lights memoir, where famous writers, musicians, artists, and people of every imaginable color and background meet and celebrate one another in an idealized, Edenic setting. Time is flying. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, if I had a chance, Paris in the 1960s as also part of what these artists are kind of vibing on, in particular Bob Thompson. And I was also going to try to talk about coming back to Tanner and the resonances between his work and the artists who followed him. And I was going to also try to talk about this work, which is in Duke's collection, which also underscores not only his relationship with the masters, but how he takes that apart, how he breaks that apart. And I was going to try to riff and think about this work by Tanner from 1914, 1917, that shows the plight of not just Christ, but of himself in the grand den of inequity as reflected by the lions. And then I was going to play with that idea and think about that lion in relationship to the lions that we see in the Musée de Luxembourg. And then I was going to end ultimately with thinking about how contemporary artists, even wild and wonderful Kanye West, in his spring summer show of what is it, 2011, is still continuing this amazing conversation. Thank you.
If you don't own the servers, curating and aggregating and doing Black studies in the digital era. A typical morning, opening up the Mac Air to check for social media mentions, monitoring the traffic at New Black Man in Exile, and then finally a scan of my curated list of the YouTube and SoundCloud sites to see which sites have uploaded new content and what of that content will be of value to embed on my site and also share to my social media followers. In many ways, this activity is no different than the millions of Americans who for the past century have sat down at kitchen tables or while commuting to work by car, bus, or rail have checked for the news of the day, with one caveat. There was no easy process to share what they have read or heard, save word of mouth, which for the sake of argument we'll accept as an analog version of social media. On this particular morning, the gem of a find is Professor Bianca Williams' recent lecture at the Franklin Humanities Institute on Radical Honesty, a Black feminist approach to truth-telling. Professor Williams, who teaches at the University of Colorado at Boulder, was a Duke undergraduate and a product of the doctoral program in the Cultural Anthropology Department at Duke, was my first graduate teaching assistant when I arrived at Duke, so I was genuinely thrilled to share her ideas to an audience larger than the dozens who were in the room when she gave her address at Duke weeks ago. The analytics tell me that there have been close to 1,000 hits to her talk on my page 2 days after its posting, and has reached close to 5,000 on the 4 Facebook sites I manage or co-manage. Within the modest digital ecosystem that I curate, New Black Man in Exile generates average traffic of 120,000 hits per month, and my primary Twitter pages generates 1.5 million Twitter impressions per month. Professor Williams' post in this context was a hit. While the analytics matter, they are an index of what foundational digital humanities scholar Henry Jenkins calls spreadability. What matters more in this context is the very impulse towards spreadability, which in many ways was unimaginable even a decade ago. Social media in the digital era, thinking primarily in this instance of platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, and Instagram, is largely premised on the so-called democratization of opinion engagement, and in theory, knowledge production. It is also a moment marked by the ratcheting up of anonymous hate speech and what Tom Nichols calls the death of expertise. What we might signify as digital Black studies or Black digital studies or a nascent Black code studies is born of this era and what might be described as a renaissance of Black studies that thrives in the spirit of the foundational vision of Black studies as a knowledge project in which knowledge production is presumed to engage grassroots activisms in the spirit of the late 1960s, where the expectation was that the presence of Black thinkers on predominantly white institutions would engender the siphoning of the resources of said institutions for the benefit of Black liberation struggles, however broadly defined. To be sure, we have witnessed almost 3 generations of institutionally funded and vaguely imaginative and unimaginative efforts to bridge the gap between town and gown, and those dark spatial realities within town in which town has little interest in engaging, let alone gown. Yet what has been clear is that Black studies as a project and entity has largely been siloed on the margins of these institutions, tolerated and managed, and rarely deployed except in the management of the very bodies of students that were critical to the presence of Black studies on these campuses in the first place. That Black studies has indeed produced a body of compelling and sustainable scholarship, most often in the service of community, seems to have gone unnoticed and unrewarded by most institutions. Even the pearly gates of Cambridge, on occasion, dances for dinner. For the sake of our consideration of the digital turn, if we were to imagine a university as hardware, Black studies functions as neither firmware or even operating system, yet it is part of a network of interchangeable and always already affordable apps. It was this distancing of Black studies from the centrality of the institution, yet existing as a metaphor for the colonial vine, that led the former Gerald McWhorter to break from the Institute of the Black World, a Black studies think tank that he co-founded with William Strickland, Stephen Henderson, and the late Vincent Harding, on the basis that Black studies, per this framing, needed its own hardware. And indeed, McWhorter was not alone if we consider the short-lived Malcolm X Liberation University, which was founded in Durham, North Carolina, in the aftermath of the Allen Building takeover in 1969, and rooted in the inability of Duke University to fully imagine a Black studies project at that time. The scholar formerly known as Gerald McWhorter, AKA Abdul Al-Kalalamat, was still on this journey well into the digital era with his highly influential H-Afro-Am listserv. As half of the folks in the room now ask, what's that? Which is an index of both the never digital and those who were born digital. As a generation of social media platforms came online, Akalamat's listserv had that weird ability to break news that most in the world knew about 3 weeks earlier, but which was generally breaking news for those on his listserv. It was not simply the case of a generation of frankly 60-something-year-old Black studies Luddites, though it was still that, but a legitimate suspicion of the proliferation of digital platforms that in the aftermath of the Patriot Act might catalyze the very surveillance state that we are now all too familiar with. Akalamat's listserv was a digital source that could be trusted, and that trust was born out of a basic reality. Akalamat owned his servers. The servers that power Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and the like are not owned by those who share interests in Black liberation projects, even as the narratives of Black liberation provide needed content for those platforms. Indeed, as Marissa Parnham recently suggested at a gathering at Johns Hopkins, Black Twitter is an apt metaphor for the exploitation of Black digital innovation. Black Twitter helped Twitter find out what its own power was. President Agent Orange be damned. Kalamat, old school nationalist that he is, never lost sight of what might be described as Black digital nationalism. And with a nod to the late Prince Rogers Nelson, he offers that if you don't own the servers own you. As such, Black studies in the digital era remains a resource issue, even as the so-called aggregation model of Black studies has arguably made Black studies more visible and importantly more accessible than it's ever been. A direct line can be drawn from the emergence of the Black Radical Congress, notably the work of Barbara Ransby and the late Manning Marable, and its inclination to harvest the internet with Black techie Art McGee, the real spook who sat behind the door, helping to build the digital infrastructure, to Alondra Nelson's editing of the now indispensable special issue of Social Text on Afrofuturism in 2002, to the Crunk Feminist Collective, which propelled co-founder Brittany Cooper as the leading voice of a generation of insurgent Black digital intellectuals, to the development of the Hortense Spillers curated The Feminist Wire, to the nascent African American Intellectual History Society, whose essays have been aggregated by the New York Times, and which has republished an essay by our own I. Augustus Durham that was initially published at New Black Men in Exile. Black studies exist in the digital realm as a vibrant, rich intellectual terrain. One need only look at the impact of the hashtag syllabus movement, the crowdsourcing of syllabi for the Charleston shooting, Beyonce's Lemonade, including Melissa Harris Perry's curated digital symposium for Elle magazine on a visual project that included our own Carla F.C. Holloway, and even Colin Kaepernick's protests to give witness to the wide accessibility of Black studies in this moment. And indeed, responding to the impulse and inclination by those with the resources to dig data deeply and mine Blackness, there have been moves within what might be called, but not compellingly so, digital Black studies that resist the ordering of things. We are witnessing a Black studies that relishes in its messiness, what historian Jessica Marie Johnson calls Black ephemera, or the flotsam and jetsam of Blackness, as if Blackness itself might not be that ephemera, or what Mandia Dewara once called Afro-kitsch. Concretely, the response from the so-called digital Black studies has been the curation of Blackness, the building of digital platforms, the construction of symbolic Black literacies or hashtags, and the privileging of back-channeling in concert with the undercommoning of the university, and then its aggregation, where aggregation functions as the ethical embodiment of Black shareability, which is the impulse, and per Jenkins, Black spreadability, which is the impact and practice. Thank you.